The Station of the Cross presents Sermons for Everyday Living, powerful sermons from faithful and inspirational priests.
Our first sermon for today is entitled Communism and Truth.
Friends, by this time you are all quite aware that I am very poor at drawing. And I was very recently showed up by a letter from a little girl in Butler, Pennsylvania, age 10. She said, "I can make better cars than you can. Your cars look like anteaters." This is my car. You made it on December the 8th. I watched your program. I will show you her car. You see, actually, she does do a much better picture than I do. The subject for this telecast, as you know, is communism and truth. And the first part of it is going to be very heavy. But bear with us because we trust that we will explain considerable about communist tactics. There's a world of difference between the notion of truth in the Western world and the communist notion of truth. For the Western world, for right reason, truth is something that can be discovered. In other words, we are searchers for the truth. Hence, thanks to science, we are making progressive knowledge about the laws of nature. There's been a revelation of divine truth. Thanks to reason, we're able to deepen an understanding of those mysteries. But truth is not final and complete here, though we are discovering it bit by bit. The ultimate truth is beyond. Perfect truth is God Himself. I am the truth. The communist notion of truth, however, is that we are not searchers for truth, because truth has been discovered. The final and absolute truth is the philosophy of Marx and Lenin. There is no more truth to be known in the history of the world. All of the contradictions in history, all of the class conflicts, and the slow evolution of men through the ages, all of that has finally come to its full development in perfect truth, which is held by the Communist Party, namely the philosophy of Marx and Lenin. That's one difference. A second difference has to do with the test of truth. How do we know that anything is true? Well, the common sense view of the Western world is we know whether a thing is true by looking at reality. For example, you say, where are the socks? And someone says, well, they're on the chair. Another one says they're on the windowsill. And someone else says they're on top of the television set. Well, is there a way of finding out which statement is true? Sure there is. Go to reality. Find out where the socks really are. They happen to be in the drawer. In other words, you test everything by reality. That's the Western and the common sense way of judging anything. Now, what's the communist view of truth? How do you know whether a thing is true under communism? You know whether it is true or not if it conforms to the party line. A bureaucratic directive is the determinant of truth. The party takes the place of God. It is not God who is the fullness of truth. It's the party. And anything is true simply because it's in accordance with that line. Hence, if you said, where are the socks? Well, Molotov would say, the socks, they're in the hands of capitalists because they robbed them from the feet of the poor workers. That's party line. You see, you're not testing anything by reality. Hence, under communism, you do not have truth, as we do in the Western world. Rather, you just have a myth. Now, that being so, let us enumerate some consequences. First consequence of this communist notion of truth is there must be an iron curtain. There has to be. And why must there be an iron curtain? Well, here's the reason why there must be an iron curtain. Suppose there was a mother who had a little boy, but she always wanted a little girl. So, she dresses up the little boy as a little girl. And she curls his hair and so forth, and she tells him there are no little boys in the world. The world is just full of little girls. That's the party line. That's not reality. Now, in order to maintain that party line, what must she do? She always... My angel's going to have a hard time erasing the insulin. She has to erect an iron curtain so that he will never, never in his life see a little boy. Because if he sees the truth, reality over here, then, lo and behold, the myth is completely exploded. And so it is with the communists. Why do they have to have an iron curtain? Because they're telling the people that inside of Soviet Russia is peace, is prosperity, is all that is good and perfect in the world. That's the myth. In order to perpetuate the myth, constant propaganda. They cannot let anyone cross that iron curtain. They cannot allow any broadcast to come over from the real world, because the real world will completely disprove everything that is told here in this land of myth. That is why the Soviet diplomats are all spied upon by other Soviet agents with 3 layers of espionage. And each layer of communist intelligence reports back without ever letting himself or themselves be known to another layer of spies. Everyone has to be protected against getting real knowledge. The Iron Curtain, the police state, is an essential in a land of myth, where there is a denial that is the reality, that is the determinant of truth. So that if the communist people are very poor and they go without shoes, Soviets have got the answer. They say, "You're without shoes? Oh, my good people, don't you know that in America the people have no feet?" Well, that's the first consequence, the necessity of an iron curtain. And the second consequence of their false concept of truth is the fluctuation of their tactics, their strategy, their approach to the Western world. The communists have... My angel did a good work with that line, didn't he? They have, first of all, an ultimate truth. The ultimate truth for them is world revolution and the establishment of the party line throughout the world. Then they have proximate truth. The proximate truth... Oh, yes, I should have told you before. I just now thought of it. A good example of that Iron Curtain is that there was that song, remember, years ago, "How are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris?" Four million Russian soldiers deserted during the First World War. Sure, the reason they deserted, they got over into the real world. So now, here the communists say there is such a thing as approximate truth, our tactic. So Lenin says we have to zigzag. We do not go up straight up a mountain. We every now and then will retreat. And we will present ourselves as favorable to the enemy, at another moment as unfavorable. And hence, the tactics are always like the tactics of a boxer, to throw the opponent off guard. So at one time, the communist line is the Nazis are our enemies. Then they sign a treaty with the Nazis. Then they turn against the Nazis. Why? Because It was considered good tactics for the moment. In other words, truth is relative to any historical moment. And they will say anything that will further the ultimate truth, which is world revolution. The communists are upset sometimes when the party line is changed, but there's nothing they can do about it. One of our missionaries in China was asked by the communists when he was on trial, give us the definition of truth. And this missionary said, truth is the conformity of the mind with reality. And this communist judge says, no, that's not true. He said, this is the definition of truth. Whatever the party says today is true for today. Whatever they say for tomorrow is true for tomorrow. Hence, when we came into China, we wrote freedom of religion on all of the fences. That was true for that day. Now we persecute you. That's true for today. Now, the pity is that our Western diplomats, instead of judging communism by its philosophy, judge the Soviets by their attitude toward the Western world. And when the attitude is favorable, they say communism is all right. When it's unfavorable, then they say communism is all wrong. No, communism must be judged by its philosophy. And what is its philosophy? They are bent on world revolution. They will use any strategy, any lie. They will even speak of a Geneva spirit for which we fell. Our Western world should know that materialists have no spirit. That a spirit is impossible for a materialist. And then the third conclusion that is to be drawn from their false concept of truth is the impossibility of ever arguing with a communist. Why? Suppose you give a baby an open safety pin, a bottle of milk, a rattle, a pencil, an old razor blade. And suppose you begin reasoning with the 2 or 3 year old child and say, now, I want you to take what is best. I want to prove to you that the very best thing for you is the milk. This milk is homogenized, it's full of vitamins, and it'll make you strong. You'll grow to be the big American boy. You'll never have to eat breakfast food if you take the milk now. You can go on giving arguments from now until the crack of doom, but how does the baby judge things? By whether or not he can get the things into his mouth. Your reason is absolutely useless with that child. How do the communists judge things? Go to the United Nations, talk about Korea, talk about Vietnam, talk about Eastern Germany, talk about the nations that are behind the Iron Curtain, talk about China. The communists do not hear the arguments. How do they judge things? By whether or not these things can be swallowed by the Soviets. They are as incapable of understanding reason about these things as the child. We know there's such a thing, for example, in the world as paranoics. Paranoics are very often intelligent people. But they always have a fixed idea, some great delusion. And when they have this delusion, the only way you can satisfy them is to bow down to it. For example, somebody has the delusion that you are to go on a trip with him to Saskatchewan. He will call 5, 10, 15 times a day for 30 or 40 days. You say, no, I'm not going to Saskatchewan. Gets away from the house, he's forgotten all about it. He's got Saskatchewan in his mind. When he gets the trip to Saskatchewan out of his head, he's all right. But while they are possessed of that myth, that delusion, you can do nothing with the paranoid. The Soviets are possessed of a myth, of a delusion. And When we talk, for example, about problems of the world, they do not hear the arguments. They are absolutely impervious to logic or to arguments. They do not understand them. They cannot follow them. So they will attack. They will slander. They will reverse the argument and speak of the Soviets as being a land of peace and so forth. But as far as the argument is concerned, they never seem to hear it. What are we doing in the Western world? We're appealing to facts. We're appealing to a world of reality. And we say, well, test these things by facts. But the communists do not test things by facts. Their idea of truth is not judged by reality. It's judged by conformity to the party line. And give all the facts you please. When the party line comes over to them at the United Nations, they speak the party line. And they cannot understand a reason. When they get out of that delusion, when they go to a cocktail party, they're normal. Talk like anybody else. They'll be very reasonable. They're human. Give evidences of reason. But get them back where they have to affirm that myth. Nothing can be done with it. Is there anything that we could ever do with people of this kind? Really, it makes one wonder if there was not a kind of a possession. The Gospel mentions cases of individual possessions where an individual had a devil such as the demoniac and the Gerasenes, but here we've got collective possession. All of these people together who believe the truth is in the party line, they are not like people in an insane asylum, because there one crazy person balances another. The man that thinks he's Napoleon is balanced off with the man who thinks he's the Duke of Wellington. But here, what is it you've got here? You've got a collectivity, you've got a possession. They do not know precisely what they are driven to. They only know that there's some drive in them. How explain the fact, for example, that Chinese young girls want to see their mothers killed? How explain the fact that boys will watch the assassination of their fathers? What is this terrible thing, this great vampire that's sucking blood out of the human brain all over the world? It's a form of paranoia. Maybe it's a form of possession. It has to be something very evil to destroy goodness and morality and law and order. Well, is there anything we can do? Maybe there's one thing we can do. We cannot talk about the Western world because this is a world of reality and they do not understand reality. We should not be just attacking them because that gets nowhere. Maybe there's one thing we could do, and that is, if at the United Nations we brought up one subject, namely the subject of Poland and Lithuania and Albania and Hungary and every other country behind the Iron Curtain, and all the countries behind the bamboo curtain, we brought up that subject. And we asked that this question of the free determinations of people be decided before any other question is settled. And suppose we said to the Soviets, here is the statement we want you to hear. And we want free determination there because there's reality and there's myth. The people are real, they want the truth, but they're submerged by this myth. So we say to them, listen to this statement. I will tell you later who said it, but we address it to the Soviets. If any nation whatsoever is detained by force within the boundaries of a certain state, and if that nation, contrary to its expressed desire, is not given the right to determine the form of its state life by free voting and completely free from the presence of troops, of the annexing or stronger state, and without any pressure, then the incorporation of that nation by the stronger state is annexation, it is seizure by force, it is violence. Who said this? Nikolai Lenin. Then Soviets under God follow it. Free these people. That's the first thing that we have to solve in the world. And then our other problems will be solved. No other problem will be solved until we liberate them. They're strong. They're very strong. Why? Because they believe in an absolute. They believe in a truth, the truth of the party line, and they believe in it with such fervor and faith that they are. Is that 26:40? Is that time for me to quit? Is that 26:40? 1 minute yet? See, I get so rattled. But they have a faith in an absolute. And that gives them great strength and great zeal. Our weakness, really, is the fact that we are not sure in America that there is any truth. We are something like Pontius Pilate. When our blessed Lord appeared before him, our Lord said, I am come to give testimony of the truth, and all who are of the truth hear my voice. And Pilate turned his back on truth and sneered, what is truth? They have thrown down the gauntlet. And they have reminded us that the choice before the world is not some humanitarian society and communism. It is either brotherhood in Christ or comradeship in Antichrist. They have chosen that particular comradeship. It is for us as a free nation to choose the truth, to choose the good, to choose and affirm God and the freedom of the peoples of the world.
We hope you enjoyed this sermon entitled Communism and Truth. Our next sermon for today is entitled The Vacuum and Emptiness in American Life.
Fellow Americans, as I wait off stage, I hear you enjoying yourselves. And I think to myself, isn't it terrible to go out and stop all of that fun? I'm reminded of a 7-year-old boy who had never spoken a word in his life until one morning at breakfast. Parents had done everything to get him to speak. One morning at breakfast he said, "This cocoa's cold." And the parents said, "Why didn't you talk before this?" He said, "Up till now everything was okay." And it's nice to see a crowd like this, too. And apropos of a crowd, there was a woman in New York who was learning Spanish. I mean English. She was Spanish. And she was learning her Spanish out of her English out of a book without any definite pronunciation. Now you can imagine how the pronunciation turned out when she had no teacher except a book. She went to Radio City for a movie, and the only seat in the entire place was in the middle of a row of sailors. And she started worming her way in, and to each sailor she said, "Squeeze me, please. Squeeze me, please." This is another in the series of what now America, and we are concerned in this particular telecast with the vacuum and the emptiness in American life. We're beginning to be glum, not as lighthearted as we used to be. One of the very telling statistics about this is the growth of suicides among the young. Under the age of 19, suicides among the young have increased 200% in the last 2 years. One girl, 18, left a note after she committed suicide, and she said, "Life is garbage. People are garbage. What's the use of living?" There are more whites that commit suicide than blacks. More city people than country people. More people living in difficult circumstances than the affluent. Many more suicides among those who lead licensed sexual lives than among those who have some restraint. More suicides among Americans than among Russians. Now, why is this? Well, partly, I think, because, as Dr. Menninger said, some people commit suicide because they have a desire to kill. Now, they do not wish to kill themselves, but they've been disappointed in love. And so their aggression comes out against themselves when they would like to be aggressive against another. A perfect example of this is the Mark Twain story of Tom Sawyer. Tom Sawyer thought one day of committing suicide by throwing himself into the Mississippi River. He said, "Just think of what my aunt will think. I can see her crying and saying, 'Oh, if I'd only been better to little Tom.'" The aggression was really directed against her. I heard of a suicide of a young husband who took his own life simply because he wanted to be aggressive against his wife, who was rather good to him. And a second reason for suicide that is given is the desire to be killed, and that's because there's guilt in the human soul. A perfect example of that is Judas, who sold his master for about $17.40. A perfect example of how divinity is always betrayed out of all proportion to its due worth. He could have sought pardon, but he did not, and so he took a rope and went out and walked the cold, hard earth. The rock seemed just as cold as his own heart. And every limb of a tree seemed to be a finger pointing. Traitor. And every knot in every tree seemed to be an eye. So he hanged himself in despair. Then another reason for this gloom and vacuum in American life is our literature, which is one of despair. Have you noticed that many stories and novels do not conclude, they just end? Take, for example, the drama of Sartre, Huis Clos. Here are some men in hell, and each of them is concerned only with his own aches and pains. He has no interest in his neighbor, and his last line is, each neighbor is waiting to talk about himself. The last line is, "My neighbor is hell." Why? Because he stands over against me. He limits me. He's a non-me. And the ego is everything. Then the play Sisyphus, which was based upon the old legend of Sisyphus pushing a rock up a high mountain, and whenever he got near the top, the rock fell back. And then he would push it up again, and the process went on endlessly, and that is life, never achieving a goal or a purpose. Was it not T.S. Eliot who said that the world will end not with a bang, but with a whimper? And typical of this despair the novel, The Factory on the Other Side of the River. There's one factory on one side of the river where great rocks are ground up into very fine powder. Then they're transported to the other side of the river, and on the other side of the river, they are made into big rocks. Then they're shipped back to the first factory to be made into powder again, and the process continues endlessly. This is the despair of modern literature and the modern world. We're going no place. It's not like the tragedy of the ancient Greeks, for tragedy was always in a plan. Now ours is without a plan or a purpose. We do not have tragedies such as Shakespeare wrote about, or Hamlet when he debated to be or not to be. That is the question. And then he went on to say, for who would fardels bear, to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death? That undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns puzzles the will and makes us rather bear the ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. That's tragedy with a plan. Now, what are we to say to fellow Americans about this vacuity in modern life? Well, we'll try to give some answers and some hopes. One thing I believe that we have to do in our American life is to get rid of our depth psychology, our constant analysis. Do you know what has happened in our modern life, modern science? No, this is the way the world used to be. The world used to be thought of this way: a heaven and an earth and a hell. That merely meant, I'm going someplace. I ought to go someplace. This is where I am. And if I do not do as I ought, well, then I could end up rather badly. It was a big universe. It was immense. You know what has happened today in our psychology? We've locked up. The only perfect thing I can draw is a circle. That's not bad. Just forget this. What they've done is moved the universe into the mind, and this becomes the superego. This becomes the ego, and this becomes the id. So, for relief, we're constantly analyzing the id. It's a sewer. It's an old cellar, and we throw old clothes and old pots and pans down there. And the result is that life has been dammed up. We're inside a prison and we've never tried the door. The door is open. Actually, what we need is not a psychoanalysis. We need in life a psychosynthesis. We need to put life together. And we're only going to get out of this cellar existence what we threw into it anyway. We should be concerned about the top of life, not with the bottom. And this constant emphasis on the locked mind, as if there were nothing more in the universe than this brain of ours, makes us very much like a child in a womb. If one of the protagonists of this theory went to a child in the womb, he would argue this way: you're locked up in darkness. Now forget that there's another life. There isn't another life. That's the only life there is, the one that you're living. Now, if the child could speak, do you know what the child would say? What do you mean there's no other life than this? Look at my legs, all cramped up inside of this womb. They were made to walk.
I can't walk in here. Somewhere there must be goals and a way that I can pursue. I have eyes. These eyes can see nothing, but they were made to see. Maybe there are mountains, maybe there are rivers and lakes, maybe there are beautiful things for me to see. Otherwise I wouldn't have these eyes. My hand, useless here, closed, meant to open, fingers. Maybe I could be a Bach, Beethoven, Michelangelo. That's what the child would say to anyone who said, "Oh, this is the only life there is and you're locked up in it." And so we say, I'm in the womb of time, and this is not the only life there is. There's another. I've got an intellect that's made for truth. And somewhere there is a truth. Not just options, not just opinions, not points of view, but an absolute to which I can make an eternal commitment. I wouldn't have a will that pursues goodness and beauty if there was not a beauty that leaves all other beauty pain. And the life that I want, there must be therefore another life than this, otherwise I would not yearn for it. And so one of the ways, therefore, to escape from the boredom and the thraldom of life is to begin to synthesize our existence and not think of ourselves as locked up eternally in this womb of time. That's one way to escape the boredom. And another way, which is immediately related to it, is to discover the purpose and the goal of life. Now, while I'm talking to you about the goal in life, I have a little angel that just came down that's going to clean the blackboard. Isn't that interesting? See, that's the great advantage, too, of living in a bigger world than this little thing with an id at the bottom. I say to discover a purpose and the goal in life. One of the greatest psychiatrists in the world who has given us a real philosophy of life, because he lived through 2 concentration camps and who should have despaired, was Viktor Frankl, a Jewish neurologist of the University of Vienna. He went through a Nazi concentration camp, a Soviet concentration camp. And he developed a psychiatric theory called logotherapy, the curing of the ills of life by finding goals and purposes and meaning, even in trials. He certainly had a great trial, and when he was a fairly young professor, he told me, he was invited to come to America to teach in one of our American universities his theory of psychotherapy. Logotherapy, rather, not psychotherapy, logotherapy. Logos meaning and therapy cure. But he had a difficulty. Hitler was killing the Jews. His father was still living. Should he leave his father in Vienna to be killed by the Nazis, or should he take this job in America? He went over to the Church of St. Stephen in Vienna, prayed for an hour for an answer, and apparently he received none. He came back to his house, and that evening at dinner, he said to his father, "What's that piece of marble over there?" Oh, his father said, "I was out walking this afternoon, and I rummaged among the ruins of the synagogue that Hitler burned. And I discovered this block of marble. He said, "Did you read what is on it?" The first Hebrew letters of the commandment, "Honor thy father and thy mother." So Dr. Frankl stayed in Vienna. And because he was a distinguished neurologist, Hitler did not kill him, and he closed his own father's eyes in death. No wonder he developed a therapy of meaning, simply because he had it in his own life, and in an eminent degree. I met a man once who told me that Dr. Frankl saved his life. He said, "I was in this Nazi concentration camp and we were being persecuted. This particular day I stayed in bed, and Dr. Frankl came to me and said, 'Get up. You've got to live this day. You've got to meet this challenge. Shave, even though you have to do it with a piece of glass.' And from that time on, he said, my life was transformed. Later on, he escaped. As a matter of fact, I appointed him a professor in a seminary which I had charged once. So here is psychiatry coming to our aid and saying, you'll get over all of this gloom and despair if you've got a purpose and a meaning in life. See, despair comes because too many people are gyroscopes instead of radars. Now, on every plane, there's a gyroscope. And there's a radar. What is the gyroscope? The gyroscope, if you've ever been in the cockpit of a plane, will tell the engineer about every surrounding object, the clouds. Hence a pilot can announce to you, fasten your seat belts, we're soon running into a cloud bank. Other planes, tall buildings, mountains, all of them are registered. Everything from the outside gets onto this gyroscope. Now, that's the way most people are. They're only gyroscopes. They're sensitive to the immediate environment. Styles, the latest styles. Slacks, even though there is no slack. Anything. Anything that happens to be in. Anything that happens to be it. What is the latest? Using the in words, which only last about 3 years. Whoever hears today of the word fascist or involvement, all dead. People have no goal at all except that which immediately surrounds them. And that's why their life is maddening. What they ought to be is a radar. And the pilot will set his radar at a port, an airport. And he will follow that beam. That's what Dr. Frankl means by getting a logos, getting a goal, getting a meaning in life, and then following it all through. And as soon as we stop being gyroscopes and begin to be radars, then life will take on a meaning for us. Then life has, as a result of this, the ability to get beyond despair. Why do people despair? I think in part because they see life as a contradiction. There is the vertical bar of life, upright. And they see life as contradicted by the horizontal bar of death. So life is without any meaning or purpose. Well, it would seem that way. But suppose you put somebody on that cross that would say to you, death is the condition of life. A little sacrifice is the condition of obtaining great success. If there's a Good Friday in your life, then there will be an Easter Sunday. Then there's no longer despair. Death and life are reconciled. So the giving up of something immediate for the sake of something future. That's the way to escape from despair. And then life becomes an adventure. A great joy, a thrill. I remember I crossed the Atlantic about 26 times. And I was seasick about it every time but 2 in the days of boats. You remember what Ring Lardner said about seasickness? He said, the first half hour I was seasick, I was afraid I was going to die, and the next half hour I was afraid I wouldn't. Well, I can remember one crossing. There was a dog on the upper deck, and the dog was being shipped from Europe to America, and there was no passenger on board that knew the dog. Anybody who was walking on the top deck, he'd growl at it, refuse to eat food. And why? Because, well, he was in entirely new surroundings, water, not earth. The earth was rocking. And so to him, life was not even worth living, or was it worth eating? Then on another trip, there was another dog, but there was a little girl on board the boat that owned the dog. And every now and then, that little girl would come up and feed her dog, and the dog was sociable, wagged his tail when strangers came about, and one of the reasons that he did it, I suppose, was this dog knew, well, I don't know where I am. I don't recognize any smell, no hydrants, but I know that my little mistress would not have put me on this boat unless she was going to get me out of it. And so I will resign myself. She knows best. She's always been good to me. And someday I'll get to my native life. So the dog was normal. Life becomes an adventure, you see, when you have a goal. Many people are like that dog. They don't know why they're here. They don't know why they're going. Life is confusing. And others, well, they have a goal and a purpose. First of all, they have an immediate task to perform. And even though there be difficulties, what difference does it make? Sure, there are going to be storms at sea, but these difficulties and storms are not permanent. When I go into a theater or read a book about a heroine being killed, for example, in the first act, I don't close the book or I don't walk out of the theater. I give the dramatist credit for a plot. And so when there are trials and difficulties in life, when there are storms, I still give the dramatist, the divine dramatist, the credit for a plot. It is the last act that crowns the play. Thank you, and God love you.
We hope you enjoyed this sermon entitled The Vacuum and Emptiness in American Life. Our final sermon for today is entitled An Insight on Love.
Now, when you're speaking of the family and these new customs that have sprung up, we have only eros, the erotic love. We have a love in which the ego projects itself into another and says, I love you, when all that is loved is the pleasure that is found in the other person. And this kind of love is the destruction of the family and the destruction of the human person. As a matter of fact, I believe one of the reasons why we have so much neurosis and psychosis is this tremendous affirmation of the self. I got to do my thing. I have to have my pleasure. You bend yourself to my will. When real love does not mean to have and to own and to possess. It means to be had, to be owned, to be possessed. The ancients were right in giving Cupid an arrow, something that wounds, something that sacrifices self for another. Do these people ever show love, for example, for their neighbor and for the downtrodden? No. It is generally for the satisfaction of self. So this kind of life is producing neurotics and psychotics in our civilization. People today are without goals and without purposes. That is one of the reasons why our civilization is erotic. We try to make the intensity of a sex experience atone for a want of a purpose in life. Just as when we're lost in an automobile, we drive faster. We have no power over the divine law. Furthermore, suppose we did. Suppose John Paul II tomorrow said, all right, bring out your contraceptives. Pull out your scalpels. Unplug the children from their wombs. Marry as you please. Unmarry as you please. Fornicate as you please. What would be the difference between the church and the world? What do you want? Why are you bored? You want three things. If you could take your heart out as a kind of crucible and distill out of it its inmost cravings, what would they be? One, you want life. Not for 5 more minutes. Not for 5 more years. What else do you want? You want truth. Not just what you read in the paper. Truths of geography, literature, science, everything. We hate to have secrets kept from us. Thirdly, what do you want? Love. And a love without satiety. A love without fed-upness. A love that is constant. That's what you want. Now, do you find them here? Do you find life here? No. Why? Because life is mingled with its shadow death. We get old. Truth, that's mingled with the shadow error. Love, that is mingled with the shadow hate and satiety. So here we are in this rat race. Something we want, something we can't find. What's the answer? Are we to say life is a mockery? Are we to say, as we might in this room, what's the source of light? Not under the chair, there's light is mingled with shadow. Not behind the bookcases, there light is mingled with darkness. We would say as logical beings, well, source of light, I have to go out to something that's pure light. So, if you want a life and a truth and a love, a life that is not mingled with the shadow death, and a truth that is not mingled with the shadow error, and a love that is not mingled with the shadow hate, you want pure life, pure truth, pure love. That's what you want. That's only a definition of God. And when you want that, you have everything, and then everything fits in place.
This has been Sermons for Everyday Living from the Station of the Cross Catholic Media Network. Please pray 3 Hail Marys for the priest who preached in today's show. To share this episode or to hear it again, find us on your favorite podcasting app under Sermons for Everyday Living. Have a blessed day.
This podcast has been brought to you by the Station of the Cross Catholic Media Network, a listener-funded nonprofit organization. Please prayerfully consider making a donation at thestationofthecross.com or through our free iCatholic Radio app. You can also support us by leaving a positive review for this program on your favorite podcasting app and by sharing this episode. Thank you.